conquer and we're going to take some. Is that understood? Yes, sir. That's what we're going to do, sweetheart. We are going to go and get some. All right, people, on the ready line. Are you me? Yeah! Are you me? Yeah! What are you? What are you?
The support systems of family and community are an integral part of the holidays for those that are caring for loved ones with special needs. Through the love and diligence of his family, Jeremiah Feliciano was able to live a healthy and productive life despite his rare genetic disease. Read his story and much more in EP's annual Family and Community issue. To read more, sign up for free today at www.epmagazine.com.
Monotony. It comes in all shapes and sizes. Dull, tedious, just plain boring. But what is this? A contender, perhaps? Something unboring by the looks of it. Jabs right at dull, an uppercut to tedium, something that keeps you on your toes, keeps your head on a swivel, a knockout punch to your old, boring workouts. Welcome to Fight Camp.
Oscar Mike Radio is a proud podcast partner of Reach Across America Radio, heard every Thursday at 11 a.m. and Sunday at 8 a.m. Eastern. They're also big supporters of the nonprofit I Got Your Six, 2 Lives at Once. And with every wreath you sponsor through Oscar Mike Radio, $5 goes back to this great organization dedicated to making a difference in the lives of veterans, law enforcement, firefighters, and first responders battling PTSD. 2 Lives at Once pairs these brave men and women together with dogs rescued from kill shelters. In this way, 2 lives are saved at the same time by saving each other. Donate now. Go to reachacrossamerica.org/Oscar Mike Radio to help. That's reachacrossamerica.org/Oscar Mike Radio.
I remember a time when I was in a not so good place, and these games and these activities and being able to come and have the camaraderie that we have here, it makes me feel like I'm not alone. There are people here that have been through what I've been through. It makes me feel like I don't know, I'm part of something great.
Just let yourself go. Give it a try.
Hello and welcome again to Oscar Mike Radio. My name is Travis, Marine Corps veteran and your host. Oscar Mike Radio is part of the Hubazoo Network. You can find out more on hubazoo.com. I want to thank my sponsors, Joyce Asek of Asek Real Estate, Army National Guard veteran, Mark Holmes of Reapers Detailing and Power Washing, and my supporters, Case on Shaving Company and Exceptional Parent Magazine. Thank you so much. Last October 17th, for number 418, I had on my, previous, now current guest, attorney, professor, Charles Moxley. We talked about nuclear war and the role of law in nuclear proliferation elimination, and now he's coming back to kind of expand on that and answer some more questions. Sir, welcome back to Oscar Mike Radio. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Travis. I'm really so delighted to be here.
Absolutely. So we talked about how the law really can, if structured right and done right, have a role in, I'm not trying to be, use hyperbole here, but save the human race, because we've watched Chernobyl and Fukushima and, other things and projections about what would happen in the event of a nuclear war. And it's all bad, very little of it good, right? And we got into that, and I really learned how law is not just blind, it's really an active part of the human experience. But I got to read some more, watch some more, and listen, and I kind of was curious about, okay, we have the law, we have all this. How do we implement it? And then how do we enforce it? Because, like parenting, I know in parenting I can have rules, but if I can't implement the rules and then enforce the rules, well, my kids are going to do whatever they want. So, you know, in that regard, we have this. How do we implement it?
I think the way you're thinking about all this, Travis, is exactly right.
Okay.
In our earlier discussion, which I appreciated it and was glad we had the opportunity to do it, we talked about your opening question: is there law here, and has our country agreed to it? And then, okay, what is it? And we saw there, I'm not going to go back and repeat what's available,
Right.
in the earlier discussion we had, but what we saw was there is a robust body of international law, which the United States accepts, and more than that, espouses and urges to be the case, and urges upon other countries for compliance. There is law. Now, how that law gets applied is, like most law, right? Subject to how lawyers and clients and governments interpret it. So I'm not here to say, oh, everything is perfectly clear, right? But in my book, which came out a couple months ago, I studied the law as the U.S. in our military manuals and in our arguments before the International Court of Justice of the United Nations has urged that that law is, and then I applied that law to the facts that are essentially undisputable as to, as you mentioned, the potential effects of nuclear weapons. So it's clear, and I think everybody would agree that many, if not most, uses of nuclear weapons would be unlawful, right? I think you could call up the head lawyer for the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they would admit it. All you have to read is the stuff that some of our military have written about how unlawful it would be if Russia, as has been threatened, unfortunately, by Putin, were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, right? So there are legal issues. And we did talk about that before, so I'm going to pivot as you suggest. So your question, Travis, and it really is the right question. All right, great. So you're a professor and you wrote a book and you say the use of these weapons is unlawful, and you're urging an interpretation that's more stringent than our country is following now. I mean, I'm asserting that we need to revise our application of these principles, not the principles, because we all agree on the same. I don't want to overstate it. We largely agree on the principles, but how you apply them is controversial. Okay, so you're asking, how do you enforce it? And let me first give like the 2 or 3 minute, very, very broad perspective on that, and then we'll turn this,
Sure,
as we did the last time, into a conversation.
yep.
But law is out there, and it is, in the domestic context, it's enacted by Congress, right? By the Senate and the House of Representatives, and signed by the president. And that's how we make laws. And then if we're going to do an international treaty or a convention, such as in the law of armed conflict area, that we want to enter into a treaty, there's a process for that. We
Okay.
agree to it, and the Senate approves it, and it goes through a process. So that is, in a sense, I think the main area that we'll talk about. And then the military, and I know your background as a Marine Corps uh, person and your audience, there's a wide appreciation for this. The military has its processes and it wants to act appropriately and it has the training and everything. And so there's a big role there where the military, through its lawyers, and there's a large number of lawyers, as you know, in the different services and joint chiefs and this and the like. So they all put it together. So that's a whole area of law. And then one can ask, all right, what's the role of the courts? And we'll talk about that, right? I mean, as you well know, in a broad sense, the law is divided into criminal law and civil law. And criminal law are the penal statutes of the various states in our country and on the federal side in the U.S. Code. So these are criminal laws that carry criminal penalties, which obviously range from fines and probation through serious incarceration and more, right? So we have criminal laws, and then we have civil laws. And on the civil law side, there's a lot of civil laws that are passed by the Congress and signed by the president, right? But then we have the so-called common law system where judges, going back hundreds of years, back to our English ancestors in this type of law, judges through reading earlier decisions and adapting them to current needs, in effect, make law as well on the civil side. So, civilly, there can be statutes and regulations like tax laws and securities laws and human rights laws and any number of areas. We couldn't go near listing them. And then you have the laws that come from the common law from what judges tell us. So we have criminal law and we have civil law. And as you know, for a criminal law, we have prosecutors, right? On the federal state side, we have a federal law system where there's federal laws that can be prosecuted in the federal courts and state laws in the state courts, and there may be a potential for some overlap. If you're talking on the civil side, we know we live in a very litigious country, but that's part of liberty, right? That people have a right to go to court to assert their rights against someone they think is doing wrongdoing to them, right? So we have civil. So, that's the broad perspective, that somebody has to make the law, or if it's an international treaty, a country has to enter into it. And then if you're talking about enforcement in a very broad and oversimplified sense, our prosecutors in the federal and state courts are going to enforce and prosecute violations of our penal laws. And then for civil, while the government may also bring a civil case, it's mostly you or I and everybody who's, among the people we know and our listeners and all. Yeah, we have a right to go to court and assert our rights if we think someone else is violating our rights. So these are the broad perspectives, and I think that's our launching point. I'm going to stop here, Travis.
Okay, so let's just pretend that we have 200 neighbors out there, right? And the most relevant one now we're talking about is Russia and Ukraine, because as I read it, Russia has been in this a lot longer than they wanted to, and they're like, you know what, we may just nuke Ukraine, be done with it. How's this structured where Ukraine can say, hey, Russia's threatening this, or we know they're spooling up their infrastructure to launch a nuke at us? What is their way to address their self-defense, their right to live as a country? How do they go about doing that in the aspect of these laws around nuclear weapons?
When we make the transition from the domestic law to international law, there is no doubt that there is a loss potentially in terms of enforcement.
Okay.
For business, for commerce, there is a regime of law that's recognized across the world.
Okay.
You know, although we don't, in a broad sense, have a world court for hearing those commercial disputes, subject, as on all these things, to some exceptions. But there's a whole area of arbitration law, which is an area I'm actually active in as well. When you get to international criminal law, or war crimes, I think we need to look at them broadly on two levels, and I'm going to emphasize the one that in my book that recently came out, I really tried to be pretty definitive on. Okay. On the one hand, there is the potential for prosecution within war crimes tribunals, right? There is an international criminal court. There was the Nuremberg court at the end of the Second World War. There were war crimes trials. There were similar trials in Japan after the Second World War. And we've had a number of specialty war crimes tribunals whose job of the prosecutors within those systems has been to prosecute certain war crimes. So there is some of that. And you've seen that, right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
You've seen some indictments of world leaders for violations there. So that's one area. Another area that, and when you and I were talking in our preparation session, that I mentioned, seems to me to be the most productive. If what we're asking ourselves, okay, so you know, Charlie, you've told me there's a body of law here, and it's legitimate law and legitimately applied to nuclear weapons. Some or all uses, and I would say all uses of nuclear weapons are unlawful. There are those who would disagree and say, oh, some uses, but not all. Okay, but I mean, that's the whole area. But then you posed to me at the end of our last session, and that's why we're here. You said, well, all right, but even if you're right, what difference does it make? And on one level, the premise of that question is understandable, right? Because there's no clear world court that is going to resolve that for us. I mean, the point of a court resolving something is it has authority to enforce, and it has the instrumentalities of the state to enforce its determination. We have a court, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which is part of the United Nations. And indeed, as you and I discussed the last time, that court, at the request of the UN General Assembly, had an advisory case on the lawfulness of the threat and use of nuclear weapons, right? And we talked about that before.
Right. We did.
But that's an advisory decision. So to actually say we're going to get enforcement, there are areas where we can try to get enforcement of this body of law. But I'm going to pivot from that to what I think is where you and I and your listeners and everybody we know can make a difference.
Okay.
Because your broadest question, and I cover this in my book, I say, okay, all right, let's assume you're right, Charlie Moxley. What difference? So what? And the answer to the so what, I think, was given by the United States. And I actually have the quote here. I don't know whether I'll pull it out and read it or paraphrase it, but I have it in my book several times. The United States, in our arguments before the ICJ, where the U.S. was opposing a finding that the use of these weapons is generally unlawful, right? The U.S. was saying, well, you can't say they're indiscriminate, disproportionate, beyond, what's really necessary, because we can come in with a small number of low-yield nuclear weapons, be very discriminate, very proportionate, and it's a reasonable step in the unfortunateness of war, right? So that was the defense. But obviously the challenge to the weapons was broader. It was for, not just the low yield ones, but the larger yield ones. But what was the U.S. position there? The U.S., and I have the quote. I mean, I can read it if you like.
Sure.
But the U.S. said, hey, it said to the court, don't come up with a conclusion that the use of nuclear weapons and the threat, which is our policy of deterrence, don't come out with a conclusion that these things are unlawful, because our whole defense is based on deterrence. And so, Travis, I think the United States is in a position to and should be a leader internationally in taking the next step here and recognizing the unlawfulness of these weapons, and then working with other countries, as was done with biological weapons, as you know, and chemical weapons, where virtually every country of the world has agreed that those weapons are unlawful because they're indiscriminate. But nuclear weapons are in the same way. I mean, the radiation and the dust blocking out the growing season, this whole nuclear winter thing, it's just as indiscriminate as the effects of chemical and biological weapons. So what the U.S. said to the ICJ is, you'd invalidate our defense of nuclear deterrence if you found these weapons unlawful. And what I would say, for the consideration of your many listeners and the people who watch and listen to your work, is that, shouldn't we go and look at this stuff and see if there are ways in which we need to change the policy, make it less reliant and ultimately not reliant on these weapons of questionable lawfulness, and focus on conventional weapons. Obviously, we need a defense. It's a very tough and difficult and challenging world. So, there's a lot to unpack there, but my sense is that the U.S. position before the court, the ICJ, was correct. That, if you challenge these, if you show or find the unlawfulness of these things, then we need to adjust our policy.
Yeah. So the book is Nuclear Weapons and International Law, Existential Risk of Nuclear War and Deterrence Through Legal Lens, by Professor Adjutant Charles J. Moxley Jr. He was on Oscar Mike Radio 418, and this is just heady stuff, Professor, because, the threat was there. Like, I remember in grade school being taught, hey, if you hear the alarm go, we'd have the drill, and you'd go back in the basement and hope that would do well enough. This was back in the 70s. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but that was still a thing because of the Cold War. And I wonder, you're bringing this up now, and I think people hear, that Russia has nuclear weapons and may use them, but I don't think it's really sunk in what that is. There seems to be a challenge that you have to actually really state the risk and danger in a way that people want to, take action, if I read it right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. And Travis, doing programs, like this, talking with you, it helps crystallize my thinking as well, because we're trying to do something that makes common sense. We're trying to say, what's the story here? Is there law? And what's the facts about these weapons? Just like we do for any other kind of important question, right? And I here's what I think it goes back to. Okay. I think it goes back to what the U.S. argued before the International Court of Justice in that case I referred to, the nuclear weapons advisory case, where the U.S. said, we want to comply with the law. And they argued that they, the argument was that we are compliant, but it was based on the low yield nuclear weapons, which are of much more limited effect, obviously, at least in the absence of escalation. But here's what it comes down to. It comes down, I think, Travis, to the the policy of nuclear deterrence.
Okay.
And then let me just ask you. I mean, as
Okay.
a thoughtful person, who has been thinking. I mean, I know you've been thinking about this. What do you think most people think the policy of deterrence is? Because I think this is at the heart of the problem.
Okay, I'm going to allow you, the guest, to ask me a question. That's generally not the way, attorney, but we will do this.
This is what we do in law. We try to go back and forth.
Right. So when I think deterrence, through the Marine Corps, growing up in school and playing the military video games, it's like deterrence says, hey, you know what? I've got 10 nukes over here and I've got 10 nukes over there on the other country. And if you fire at me, I'm going to fire at you and we're going to destroy each other. So the fact that we have them means that we won't use them and therefore we're all set. But I've always wondered about that because that's a lot of variables to have right for them not to be used. That's kind of what I think of deterrence is we have the B-52 bomber and the B-2 to launch nukes. We're never going to use it because no other country would even think to fire one at us. It's a lot of variables, Professor.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just nailed it, right?
Okay.
I mean, and that's the point that I thought you would. I mean, I sort of sensed you'd see it, and I'd ask your viewers. I mean, isn't that how we think about it? That, well, we're not going to have to use it. We'll make the threat, and it's all good, right? And if you listen to the Heritage Foundation, I mean, I was in a discussion when the first edition of my book came out in 2000. There was a guy at the Heritage Foundation, who had written the book, Learning to Love the Bomb.
Right.
He had written this piece saying, the bomb is great because we didn't have any, serious incidents of, of a really, really, really serious nature between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And it was because of deterrence, and deterrence works. And so, I think if that were in truth, or in reality is a better way to put it, if that were the reality, I think you and I could talk about more pleasant things. Right? But is that the reality, right? I mean,
so I question that because, going through and reading what I had from you, this term, the law of reprisal, came up. And I'm like, wait a minute, that means to me that, okay, you fire a nuke at me, I am well within my right to fire 10 back at you and make it might not be proportionate, but the reprisal allows me to defend my territory as a sovereign entity. Therefore, I'm going to destroy your means of being able to fire another one. So it's not really an equitable deterrence conversation when we talk about deterrence, because reprisal allows me to take whatever action I want. This is how I interpret it when I went through and read it.
Okay, I think there's two pieces impacted into that, right? But taking the latter one
Sure.
first, which is reprisal. You are absolutely right that the ultimate defense of that's argued by the defenders of the broad lawfulness of these weapons is they'll say to me, okay, Professor Moxley, even if you're right that these weapons are inherently indiscriminate, as I think they are, and inherently disproportionate because of the literally billions of deaths that they threaten, even if you're right, it all goes out the window with the law of reprisal. Right. And that is, in my understanding of the law of reprisal, a very exaggerated notion of what it is. All of the law doesn't go out the window. Reprisal is supposed to be limited. And I'm getting this, I'll cite as sources U.S. military manuals, which say reprisals are risky. As a matter of policy, we avoid them. I mean, that's actually in some of our manuals. And reprisals are subject to limitations of only so much as is necessary or proportionate to get the other side to follow, to go back into compliance with the law. So it doesn't throw all of the law out, but but you're right that it is the argument that's available against my concern that the general use of these weapons is unlawful. And we should talk about that some more. But let me go back to your other point.
Okay.
Okay. The meaning of deterrence, the nature of it. And to me, I mean, the more I've thought about it, and the more you and I have talked about it, and I've talked about it with others, and I teach this area at Fordham Law School for many, many years, over 20 years. The notion that deterrence is just the threat is very beguiling, but it is not true.
Now, why is that? Why is that?
It is not true.
Okay.
Because think of our society and think of all the bars and restaurants around every one of our military bases. And think of what we all do, whether we're in the military or not, when we go off duty, right?
Mm.
We are an open society. And so the only way, in our country, we can have a policy of deterrence is if we mean it. If we train our staff, we train our military, we buy the weapons, we have them ready, we have a war plan, we don't tell anybody it's a bluff. The thing you and I were saying earlier, well, we're going to threaten it and never have to do it. We're not telling our men and women in the service academies and in the service any of that. We're saying, oh, we hope to not have to do it, but you can pull this right out of our military manuals. If quote, deterrence fails, we have to be ready to use them. And that's, Travis, I think that's the reason you and I and others need to get proactive, because our approach and our nuclear weapons policies don't just happen. The Congress has to approve every weapons system, and they're involved in the policy, and the executive forms it. And there's the heavy, we talk about, and you've talked on other programs of yours, the military industrial complex, but we know the revolving door. We know the companies are making trillions of dollars on this, and the manufacturing and planning takes place throughout the country in every congressional district, right? So we have this policy that we have to be ready to use it. So deterrence creates a regime that fosters not only risk of inadvertent use because of human or equipment failure,
right,
or terrorist breaking of our cyber security or the like, but just, fog of war, which you know more about than I, but things get crazy. And so deterrence is not, I'm being too long-winded here, but deterrence is not just a threat. Deterrence is a readiness at a very quick time frame, hair trigger, to charge ahead. That's the problem in my judgment.
It almost sounds like if you don't have the temptation there by virtue of the weapon, it just can't be used, period. I'm not saying deterrence is the same as temptation, but okay, I have a way to respond to a threat.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true.
So
I was thinking before we came on today, Travis, I was thinking about this, and I was looking at several of the things that our leaders have said. In the introduction to the first edition of my book, Robert McNamara, who is a figure well known in the military establishment as our Secretary of Defense back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Secretary McNamara wrote an introduction to the first edition of my book. And he says, our policy of nuclear deterrence effectively puts in the hands of the American president, acting alone, without public debate, the ability to destroy an enemy state, and if that state is a nuclear power, as it would be if we were actually to use these weapons, the initiation of action which would lead to suicide for our country. And I have a, I mean, and it's not a, and Secretary McNamara went on, and stuff that I remembered, I never fail to think of it. He said, as I have noted, human beings are fallible.
Yeah.
Even with the best of efforts and intentions, we make mistakes. And he goes on to say, it's very unfortunate in war, in the fog of war, in warfare, mistakes are made. But the mistakes that involve the types of arsenals that the U.S. and Russia and increasingly China has, and other countries, even North Korea has enough weapons. The effects are extreme.
So let's pivot. So we've understood the need. We've understood the role of law in facing this need. We understand that, the different aspects of law as it applies to this. But let's just say you get the outcome you want. You can sit there and say, you know what, we are going to either dismantle or deprecate our nuclear capability worldwide right now. How do you make sure that that never changes, or that some other nation says, you know what, I know I signed some treaty, to some nation state a half a world away, but I'm going to have this secret squirrel program where I develop my own nuclear weapons just in case. How do you enforce it?
Right. I mean, that's obviously a problem.
Okay.
And we have to acknowledge. I mean, I'm the first to acknowledge. I mean, I am not saying, and there should be no mistake, I'm not saying unilateral disarmament and we just step back. I'm saying, and this is not an auspicious time, right? Because the US and Russian diplomats at the UN are not even talking to one another. This is a very difficult time. But times change, and there have been periods where countries can talk. And so I think our country can be a leader towards this. And there is even a potential for a broader level of leadership if one looks at repercussions, right? Because there are going to be irrational leaders or crazy leaders who might bring down destruction intentionally. But most leaders are going to be rational and aren't going to be doing it intentionally. But there's such a risk of things getting out of control that, here's the point: human survival, the sense that, and in another introduction to my book, to the first edition, Costa Sippis, who was the head of international security affairs studies at MIT, has a very interesting discussion. He says nuclear weapons are not even weapons. I mean, weapons are a tool that you use in war by having more of or more powerful of than your adversary. But it is suicidal. I mean, our policy of deterrence becomes, as we've discussed before, I think, mutual assured destruction, which is if you destroy, New York and Washington, Chicago and San Francisco, we'll destroy, Moscow, will destroy all your civilians and all your cities. It is suicidal. So it's, I mean, it's a point where it's almost as if we have to change our way of thinking, right? Because we believe in strength. We all intuitively believe,
Right.
we need to be stronger than our adversary, right? And so that they can't threaten us. But in a world of an adversary who has comparable or has nuclear weapons, our security is not having more, but having a mutuality of security so that our enemy feels secure themselves and not a need to do something that's self-destructive.
So let me ask you this. You've taught this, you've talked about this, but tell me, when you're in the room and you're talking with somebody either from this country about this who may or may not agree with you, in other parts of the world, what are those conversations like? Because depending upon what's agreed upon, the entire scope of how you, to your point, in act security from a mutual standpoint is going to be changed, hopefully forever. What are those conversations like, Professor?
I think you nailed it. And I think, unfortunately, the answer goes back to our earlier point that the policy of deterrence means that we are ready to use these weapons. So that's the discussions. We are ready, and we could have another session on the hair trigger, how ready we are. We are extraordinarily ready to use these weapons on very short time frame. And everybody, certainly political leadership, it's hard for political leadership to be nuanced, right? I mean, I think you'll get more I know you have a variety of speakers. I think if you bring in some of the military leadership and some of the civilian leadership of our country, and of course, talking to me, you're talking to somebody from the outside looking at this. I think you'd find a deeper understanding in much of the military leadership that these weapons aren't really weapons that we can use. And the military, I bet you a lot of them would much rather have weapons that are more potentially usable without being self-destructive. For the politicians, it's hard because they don't know this area, many of them, and it's esoteric. And they have to, in our political culture, anybody in political leadership, has to be strong and a John Wayneism type thing, right? Men and women alike.
Yeah, but one of the things in the military does is execute the will of the nation state that they're defending. So you have to eventually send troops into that area, and so you're effectively signing their death warrant because of the radiation fallout and everything we just talked about. But also, it's the old adage: we had to burn the village before we could save it. There's going to be nothing there to rebuild or do because it'll be irradiated for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. I just I want to know, and maybe I will reach out to some military people and ask them, what are you really prepared to do that? Because the hair trigger is there, the nuclear football is real. So I was just curious, what's it like having these discussions one-on-one with people who are trying to answer the same question you are in their own way?
One of the things I've tried to do, Travis, is uh, have dialogue with people within our military and civilian governmental establishment. And I've been fortunate to be able to participate in a number of conferences, including one, by the way, I could send you the details and you could make it available on January 30 of this coming year. We're going to have an all-day conference by Zoom at which we're going to have leading figures within the military, including an officer from Stratcom and several officers from the military academies, and people like me who are interested in the area and spend a good part of their life on it. So we have these discussions. Not everybody agrees on my criticism that deterrence is a level of risk of unlawfulness that we should try to find a way not to continue to take.
So I just want to pivot one more time, if I could. I'm thinking about nuclear weapons, but I'm also thinking, well, this is nuclear weapons now. At one time, we didn't have catapults and we charged Reddit cities, and then we got catapults, and it became artillery, and we got muskets. The warfare evolves, warfare changes, and the law in and of itself, to your earlier point, does change over time. I'd have to think there's some thought you've had is if I can get some structure around this nuclear problem now, the next mass destruction weapon or extinction class weapon either A, won't be established or created, but also if it is created, then we can solve that problem sooner rather than later. Does that go through your mind at all, Professor?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
The whole premise of what the military lawyers do in advising the military in giving advice on lawfulness of weapons uses in military operations is they do it in advance. And we hope that this can happen across the board, uh, at a time before nuclear weapons are ever used. I mean, we've all, we have a sense of what the gas warfare was in the First World War. And then people came out of that and said, does this make sense for either side or for anybody? Uh, there have been authoritative. I mean, here's really the a take home, Travis, is to say, okay, what are the potential effects really? I mean, is all this exaggerated or not as to the effects? And there was a study, I think I mentioned this before, in August of 2022 by a big group of international scientists uh, on projecting the effects of weapons on climate in the climate context and otherwise, that in an all-out war between the U.S. and Russia now, you would have 5 billion deaths, 5 billion. So that's not something anybody would win. So it's not surprising that we hear, I mean, here's the point in a way. It's not surprising that we hear the president of the US and the head of Russia and the head of other countries, as we did maybe 6 months ago, say nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Right? I mean, we do hear this at the highest level, but we are, we're, I don't know the polite words to use for it, but we're notwithstanding that reality, we're continuing with this threat of deterrence and this readiness rather than stepping it back and lowering the threshold.
Well,
it would be.
To put in the vernacular, sir, the B-2, the aircraft replaced in the B-2 bomber is nuclear capable right out of the gate. That's what it's designed to do. So to your point, we are prepared to use them, even though we shouldn't.
Right. And probably you and I, and you could bring on any number of military people who might say, oh, well, the military is a separate category. And I've talked to the military who said, oh, you want to talk about military, about nuclear, that's above my pay grade, you know. But if you go into our current military plans as set forth in our military manuals, which I develop in the book, we have integrated as a matter of policy uh, nuclear with conventional weapons. And we are training our battlefield commanders to consider whether to ask for nuclear weapons if in a conventional situation it's not going well. So, I think we need to look at this and but not just the U.S., but I mean the U.S. should be a leader in it. Uh, and there will be times when discussion is possible internationally.
So what you're saying is we, the U.S., have to set the example and the tempo of this before other nations see this as a viable option for them to consider as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we're not there yet.
We're not doing it. We're doing the opposite. I mean, if you look at the numbers, we're putting so much more money into nuclear. We've bought into the notion that you summarized perfectly, that deterrence is a threat and all we have to do is threaten and we're protected. And that would be so good if we could rely on it. But when one looks at it, deterrence sets, not to go back over it, sets up a regime that is so battle ready as to, lower the threshold and raise the likelihood of use of these things, in a way that doesn't make sense.
Well, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about it's science fiction in some cases, but it's not really the aspect of AI making a lot of tactical decisions about, what a response is and enacting that response. There's concerns there. There's certainly the cyber aspect where a rogue nation could either, self-destruct our systems or do worse. So more is not more in this case. For the average, I wouldn't say average person, but for the U.S. citizen out there, Is it just as simple as writing our congressperson to say, or senators, representatives, local and federal, to say, hey, we want to see some action on this? Is that's what's missing to get the kind of outcome you're looking for?
I think that's a big part of it. I think the Congress, it's to be realistic. I mean, just ask yourself whether, I mean, we're in the middle of a presidential campaign. Obviously, it's an unusual one, but is nuclear weapons policy at the front, either at
No.
the top level or even with the senators and congresswomen alike? It's not at the front of our, because I think we've lived with it. You mentioned the 70s. I'm at least as old as you, I suspect older. And so, we grew up with it. I think it's this psychological phenomenon that the psychologists talk about denial of things that are just, how can we imagine what we're talking about here, right? I mean, the level of destruction, but mutual assured destruction by its name tells us, that it doesn't work. And there's another term which is not as familiar as mutual assured destruction. It's self-assured destruction. SAD.
Really?
And some of these scientific experts on the effects of these weapons, there's a professor at Rutgers, you should try to bring him on, Alan Robach, who has been the leader of some of these studies. And he wrote something on self-assured destruction, which is the notion that a state which initiates the use of these weapons, and he's talking about the US or Russia or other nuclear power, will bring on its own destruction as well as the destruction of its enemy. I mean, I think that's the thing. I think our sense of survival has to kick in, that we've let a psychological mechanism prevent us from realizing the irrationality of the policy we've let stay in place for several generations now.
So, but I hear what you're saying, and I'm listening, and I understand it from a very academic view. But I think about it this way: most Americans have, unless they see it in images and videos and pictures, have forgotten Pearl Harbor. Most people have put 9/11 behind them. What I'm trying to say is that the concept that America could get attacked in that way is completely, to your point, alien. So we're not trying to motivate people through fear or through some kind of feeling, but it's difficult, I feel, to create a sense of urgency, not just about this issue, but other issues, because we Americans have this sense that we're invulnerable, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we've been protected for so long because of the oceans and countries that surround us, and being master of our area of the world. We haven't been attacked. I mean, if we lived in Europe, we know genetically for hundreds or thousands of years about one attack or another.
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating. Maybe what I'm saying is exaggerated a little, but yeah, I think we feel involved. But isn't it the case, like after the pandemic came, COVID, right? Early in March of 2020 and a little before even, all of a sudden we're seeing these epidemiologists or these scientists who know about the spread of pandemics. This could have been prevented, right? And then we certainly learned on 9/11 that we didn't have an alertness level enough to use the intelligence that our system was getting, and with the financial crisis. I mean, a lawyer friend of mine was very much in the middle of the financial crisis. There were those, in 2008, I think it was, there were those who predicted that you were going to have a collapse of the economic system because of the speculation that had been inherent in all the derivatives and the like, which didn't have underlying value. So, I mean, what's the expression in the cave, in the underlying caves, the canary in the cave?
Oh, yeah.
I think the discussion you and I are having now, and that sort of drove me into this, spending all this time on this book, is that this is another situation like that. I mean, any number of our leaders have said, it's not really true that deterrence has protected us this far. We've been lucky. We've had near misses, and it could go bad, as you just said. Something could happen, and somebody could use them, or we could use them, and there could be then a use against us. It could go very bad very quickly, and the effects of these things know no borders. I mean,
No.
these same scientists on effects have projected out or modeled what would happen in a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which could happen, and they have much lower yield weapons than we. So a limited use by them of low yield nuclear weapons, much smaller than those that typify our arsenal, could cause, there have been estimates of 1 billion to 2 billion deaths. You can get this nuclear winter thing if you blow up too much debris and you block out the sun and
Right.
destroy. So people are dying from, from starvation. I mean, obviously radiation spreads, but also from starvation, which can kill, untold hundreds of millions and billions of people. So it's real. The threat is real, but human nature, I mean, our lives are pretty good in this country. And
So it's
we don't
out of
worry.
sight, out of mind. It's out of
Yeah.
sight, it's out of conception, so it's out of mind.
Yeah.
But the same current from our last conversation is true in this one. We as Americans can start demanding that our elected leadership take action on this, and it's just a matter of getting enough of us to do that.
I think that's right. I mean, I have a student in my course at Fordham Law School this semester who picked up on this topic because she's a young woman who's thinking of running for Congress when she's not a whole lot older. So she was interested in what's the role of Congress, because we tend to think that this is, run by the president and by the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs. And I've been, she's been researching it, and I've been meeting with her weekly. And the Congress has a bigger role than I had really focused on before. The Congress approves all these weapon systems. They get progress reports, they get design reports, manufacturing reports. So I think what you just said, Travis, if we could, it's a matter of, it's like Earth Day when you and I were young.
Oh yeah, yeah.
If you can raise the consciousness, ideally before disaster strikes, and but don't we need to change our mindset, because we're so imbued with the need to be tough?
It's going to require mindset change. It's going to require us to think differently. But I think that's the alternative. There's just no good alternative when you think of it that way. So I definitely understand the urgency that we have towards this. Well, Professor, attorney, adjutant professor, this has just been, time has flown by. I think this time we fleshed out a lot more of what you do. The book is fantastic, and I think this work needs to be heard. And it's just an interesting thing for me that, this isn't a problem that's going to be solved with, conventional weapons. It's going to take different solutions to make this outcome happen. And I really was interested in unpacking it with you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Travis. I'm delighted to have this discussion.
Well, look, I'm going to have the link to Professor Moxley's book in the Oscar Mike Radio show post, as well as the link to our first conversation. You can check them both out. Like a lot of things with veterans advocacy, you, the American, can take action and remember that our Congress works for us. So if we get enough voices together, we can make change. I want to thank again, Professor, for coming on. As we say in Oscar Mike Radio, we are mission in flight. Thank you for listening and watching Oscar Mike Radio, where our active duty service members and veterans are in action and the mission is in flight. Oscar Mike Radio is an oversized load co-Sinista One production. If you are a veteran or know a veteran who needs help, please dial 988 and press 1 for the Veterans Crisis Line.